Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping in for what might be the ultimate intellectual road trip. We're talking about the study of consciousness. It's widely seen as, well, maybe the single most difficult challenge in science today, and we're going to unpack why it's so incredibly hard to even get a grip on it.
Oh, absolutely. It creates this fascinating philosophical and scientific conflict right from the very start. I mean, think about it. Every other bit of science relies on a verifiable objective, a third-person view. We can measure gravity, we can see traces of the Higgs boson, we can track chemical reactions. It's all external testable data. But consciousness, the very thing we're trying to understand, is only really accessible from the first person, from the inside.
So we're trying to translate an internal reality into an external measurement. And we just don't have the tool for that. Researchers sometimes joke about needing a consciousness meter, right? Some hypothetical device that could just take your raw subjective feeling and spit out objective data. Our mission today is to look at the ingenious but also deeply flawed tools that researchers are using to try and bridge that gap and to see where the whole effort kind of hits a wall.
And that wall, it's best defined by David Chalmers' famous distinction. We've got the so-called easy problems and then the hard problem.
Right. And the easy problems are only easy in a very specific sense.
Exactly. They're only easy in that they seem approachable with their current tools, with, standard neurophysiological or cognitive models.
Yeah, they're all about function. The easy problems are things like explaining how the brain can tell the difference between stimuli, or how it pulls together information from all your senses, or how we focus on one thing over another, the difference between being awake and asleep. We can actually trace the neural pathways for those things.
We can model the mechanisms, yes, but we can't model the experience of those mechanisms. And that is where the hard problem just slams the brakes on everything. It just stops any purely reductive physicalist theory in its tracks. Because it asks the ultimate question, why does all that fancy information processing actually feel like something?
Why does the physical stuff give rise to subjective experience? That felt quality, what philosophers call qualia, like the unique sensation of smelling coffee, which is totally different from just knowing the chemical formula for the aroma.
Precisely. You can coherently imagine a perfect replica of you, what they call a philosophical zombie. It does everything perfectly. It sees the red rose, it says that's red, it avoids the thorns. But inside, there's no inner felt quality of redness. There's nothing. The lights are off. The physical facts alone don't seem to force the facts of experience to exist. And that failure, that inability to explain why it's not all just happening in the dark, that's the explanatory gap. That is the hard problem.
Okay, so if we can't measure the feeling directly, let's dig into how science tries to get around that. Starting with the most direct, but maybe the most problematic method. Subjective measures.
Right. Subjective measures are, well, they're as simple as they sound. You just ask the person what they experienced. It's the most direct route we have. The most common tool is a graded scale, like the 4-point perceptual awareness scale, or PAS. It just forces the participant to rate their experience on a scale, from no experience at all to maybe a weak glimpse, all the way up to an absolutely clear experience.
This seems like a pretty reasonable way to start, very direct.
Yeah.
But I know the second you get into self-reporting, you open up a huge can of worms. What's the biggest issue here?
The biggest issue is something called the criterion problem, and it fundamentally undermines the whole measurement. See, if we show you a stimulus that's right at the edge of what you can see, whether you report seeing it isn't just a measure of your awareness, it's also a measure of your own personal decision-making criterion.
You mean, like, how cautious I am as a person?
Exactly. One person might be really conservative, and they'll only say clear experience when they're 100% certain. They might even report no experience for something they genuinely saw for a split second. But another person might have a really relaxed criterion. They might report a weak glimpse, even if they're basically just guessing. So the criterion problem means that, statistically, it becomes impossible to tell the difference between someone with genuinely low awareness and someone who's just being really cautious. The data gets completely clouded.
Okay, so that failure in self-reporting forces researchers to look at something else, something objective. So the second big approach is performance-based measurement. Instead of asking what you saw, they measure what you did.
Correct. Objective measures assess awareness by making you do a task, maybe a forced choice discrimination. And if your performance is better than an objective threshold, which is usually just chance, and they infer you must have been aware of it. For example, if you're getting more than 50% right on a two-choice task, you must have perceived the stimulus, whether you think you did or not.
Ah, But this leads to that famous dissociation paradigm, right? Where people seem to do really well on the task even when they claim they saw absolutely nothing. And that's the big flaw in the objective method.
It is, and its specific flaw is often called the retrospective assessment or the immediacy problem. It's just really, really hard to get a simultaneous real-time measurement of both performance and subjective awareness. If we test your awareness even a few milliseconds after you've processed something, that brief, weak little flicker of conscious perception might have already been forgotten. It's just gone. So the effect then looks objectively unconscious, even though the person might have had a genuine, momentary flash of awareness that they just couldn't recall when you asked them.
So we've got subjective measures, which are all messed up by caution, and objective measures, which are messed up by forgetfulness. Where do researchers go from there? Is there a middle ground?
Well, they try. They turn to something called metacognition. This is basically a second-order judgment. It's thinking about your own thinking. The most common tool here is the confidence rating, or CR. So after you make your first decision, say you choose stimulus A or B, you then have to report how confident you are that you made the right choice.
That seems to shift the focus. It takes the pressure off reporting the clarity of what you saw, and instead ask about the certainty of your decision process.
That's the key distinction, yes. People who like CRs argue that they're a cleaner reflection of what they call phenomenal consciousness because they track so closely with how you actually perform. But, and this is a big but, the critics really push back on this. They argue that direct scales like the PAS, which are explicitly asking about the richness and clarity of your perceptual experience, are more exhaustive. They're more sensitive because they're focused on the raw input, not just your confidence about a decision you made later.
So the whole debate between these two camps is actually a debate about what consciousness even is. Is it a clear feeling, which is what PAS measures, or is it a certain thought, which is what CR measures?
Exactly right. The entire theoretical framework you build depends on which one you choose.
Which brings us to how these different measures define the actual boundaries of consciousness. Do these objective and subjective thresholds, do they ever line up in experiments?
Almost never perfectly, no. The objective threshold, which is just performance above chance, is the most conservative estimate you can get. It separates the objectively unconscious state from everything else.
And then above that line, we get into that weird twilight zone, right? Where performance is measurable, but the person says they aren't aware of anything.
That is the subjectively unconscious state, and that's the very core of the dissociation paradigm. Your brain is processing the information correctly, you're getting it right, but you will swear up and down you saw nothing. Think about that autopilot drive home. You successfully navigate all this complex traffic. That's your objective performance. But you might have zero subjective memory of the last 2 minutes of road signs. No subjective awareness.
That is a great way to put it. Is the research still suggesting this is all a neat linear progression, where you get the objective processing first, and then the subjective awareness follows?
It's turning out to be way more complicated than the simple diagrams suggest. Recent studies show the relationship is, well, it's messy. It's not always a smooth ramp up from one to the other. Researchers have even found cases where subjective thresholds, your feeling of clarity, can actually come before the ability to perform perfectly on the objective task, which totally complicates the old assumption that awareness has to lag behind processing.
Okay, let's put both of these methods to the ultimate test then, against two criteria: exhaustiveness and exclusiveness. Does either one actually work?
Well, on exhaustiveness, meaning does it capture all relevant awareness, subjective measures really struggle because of that criterion problem we talked about. An absence of evidence, someone not reporting something, is too often treated as evidence of absence, that there was no awareness, which is, scientifically sloppy. Objective measures are statistically better at proving something was there, but they still have a hard time guaranteeing they capture every single little flicker of experience.
And what about exclusiveness? Making sure the measure captures only conscious awareness.
They both fail there, too. Objective measures fail because above-chance performance is often directly caused by unconscious processing. I mean, that's the whole definition of the subjectively unconscious state. And subjective reports fail because they can be influenced by, well, confabulation. The participant just fills in the gaps or uses unconscious knowledge to justify a choice they made, which makes their report impure.
It really sounds like they're just measuring two different things,
Yeah.
which brings up the whole validity question. Are we even studying one single unified thing called consciousness?
The data really suggests we're not. Objective measures are targeting sensitivity. Can the system detect the signal? Subjective measures require the signal to actually feel like something to you, the observer. And the conflict between the two main subjective tools, PAS and CR, really highlights this. PAS is measuring the perceptual quality of the stimulus. CR is measuring a second-order cognitive ability, your confidence.
And the fact that PAS and CR often diverge in studies, that's the real smoking gun, isn't it?
It is. If consciousness were a single unitary thing, these two scales should move together perfectly. Their divergence strongly implies that consciousness isn't monolithic. It might be fundamentally multi-layered, reflecting different kinds of awareness for different things, and that's a real deep dive nugget right there. We may be measuring 3 different kinds of awareness and just lumping them all together under one name.
All these measurement problems bring us right back to where we started, to the philosophical problem, the explanatory gap.
Hmm.
If we can't even properly measure the qualia, why does the whole physicalist approach just break down?
Because physical accounts, whether they're based on classical neuroscience or even more exotic physics, they only ever deal with structure and dynamics, with how things are arranged and how they move. We can explain how the neurons fire or how information is integrated, but for any physical setup you can imagine, it's still a perfectly logical question to ask. Why does this structure generate subjective awareness instead of just processing information silently?
So if someone comes along and says, oh, I found it, consciousness is because of chaotic dynamics in microtubules or something,
Right.
the hard problem isn't solved.
No, you've just moved it. You've just introduced a new set of dynamics. The fundamental question is still there. Why should that specific physical process, quantum stuff, chaotic stuff, whatever, why should that entail an inner experience? We still need some kind of fundamental law that connects the physical world to the phenomenal world, and physics right now has no such bridge.
This conceptual dead end has pushed a lot of philosophers towards some pretty radical, non-reductive alternatives. Let's look at one of the big ones, panpsychism.
Panpsychism takes a totally different route. It sees mentality, or consciousness, as fundamental and ubiquitous, everywhere. So instead of trying to explain how consciousness emerges from non-conscious matter, it just says that some basic form of proto-consciousness is intrinsic to all matter. Basically avoids the hard problem by saying consciousness is just all the way down.
So something like Russellian monism would fit here. The idea that physics only describes the external relational properties of matter.
Exactly. It's a double aspect theory of information. Physics tells us the extrinsic stuff, how matter behaves and relates to other matter. But the intrinsic nature of matter itself is consciousness involving. And it's an elegant view because it makes consciousness a primitive feature of the universe, like space-time or electric charge. It doesn't need to be explained away.
But elegance isn't everything. It introduces a new problem that is almost as difficult as the one it's trying to solve. The combination problem.
Yes, this is its critical weakness. Specifically, the problem of subject summing. If tiny little particles have tiny little simple experiences, microqualia, how on earth do those combine into the single, unified, macro-level consciousness of a human being? If you put a billion tiny experiences together, why don't you just get a billion separate, simple experiences?
How does that collection suddenly become my single, unified, exclusive point of view?
It seems intuitively impossible. William James asked over a century ago, why don't those simple experiences just remain shut in their own skin? There's no logical mechanism we can imagine for combining separate centers of subjectivity into one coherent I.
So while philosophy gives us these theoretical escape routes, we also have some really profound empirical puzzles that seem to demand a non-physical explanation. Let's turn to some truly anomalous data. Near-death experiences, or NDEs.
NDEs present a massive scientific challenge to the standard materialist model. I mean, here you have patients who are reporting lucid, highly complex, integrated experiences, things like a panoramic life review or detailed out-of-body observations of their own resuscitation. And this is happening during periods of clinical death, specifically cardiac arrest. This is a time when the brain is severely impaired. It's technically non-functional, often showing a flat EEG, no cortical activity.
And materialism would dictate that subjective experience has to stop when the brain doesn't have enough oxygen or electrical activity.
Yeah.
So the existence of a heightened lucid awareness during a physiological blackout is a profound contradiction.
Well, scientific investigations have looked at this very seriously, especially the big Dutch prospective study. They systematically ruled out the standard materialist explanations. They found that things like lack of oxygen, or side effects from medication, or just simple fear of death, none of those could account for the cause or the incredibly complex and consistent content of the NDEs that were reported across all these different patients.
So the conclusion some people draw from this is that the brain may not be the generator of consciousness at all, which leads to this radical alternative called the transceiver model.
Yes. This model suggests consciousness might be non-local, that it could exist like fields of information, independent of the physical body. And in this view, the brain doesn't create consciousness. It acts more like a transceiver, a receiving and transmitting station that filters this huge, non-local field down into the specific, localized waking awareness we know. And during something like cardiac arrest, the brain's filter shuts down, and that non-local consciousness is allowed to express itself more fully.
But if the brain is just a receiver, how do we explain all the evidence that localized brain damage, like a tumor in the visual cortex, can just completely wipe out specific parts of consciousness? Wouldn't it be a huge hole in the transceiver model?
That's the primary objection,
Ah,
absolutely. Proponents of the model would counter that brain damage is just damaging the interface, it's damaging the filter. It restricts the quality or the bandwidth of the non-local consciousness that can be expressed through the body. It's like smashing the screen on your radio. You haven't destroyed the radio waves in the air, you've just destroyed the means of receiving them.
it's fascinating. And it really shows the high stakes in this debate.
Yeah.
Is the brain a producer or is it a filter? So we've surveyed this landscape that's just defined by conflict. We have science trying to use these inherently flawed tools. It's facing this unyielding explanatory gap. And then it's being confronted by these radical philosophical ideas like panpsychism and the empirical data from NDEs.
And if we circle all the way back to where we started, the challenge of measuring the qualitative content, the qualia, it just highlights how severe our limitations are. For decades, researchers have tried to force the incredible richness of conscious experience onto these simple one-dimensional scales, a binary choice, yes or no, or maybe a 4-point clarity rating.
We're trying to fit a subjective universe of experience into a tiny scientific lockbox.
Exactly. But some really innovative new methods, especially ones that rely on spontaneous, unrestricted verbal reports, they strongly suggest that our visual experience is fundamentally a multidimensional pattern. Our conscious experience is not binary. It's not even quaternary, a 4-point scale. It has a richness that just cannot be captured by a single number. We're failing to capture the complexity, which means our current science isn't just underestimating consciousness. It might be fundamentally distorting it by trying to force it into these simple boxes. And that leaves us with this final thought for you to consider as you reflect on this deep dive.
If our subjective experience is inherently multidimensional, and every measurement tool we invent, whether it's a performance metric, a confidence rating, or a clarity scale, if every one of those tools necessarily reduces that rich experience to a single quantifiable data point, are we doomed to always underestimate or perhaps even systematically distort the true nature of consciousness, simply by the very act of trying to measure it scientifically?